The District Court in New Mexico awarded 82-year-old Stella Liebeck over $2.8 million in damages after she spilled a cup of coffee in her lap. The case became instantly famous as an example of frivolous lawsuits and compensation culture, but in reality Liebeck had suffered third-degree burns to 6% of her body and lesser burns over 16%, and had needed skin grafts and became permanently scarred. Liebeck and her daughter asked for $20,000 as an out-of-court settlement to cover her medical expenses. McDonald's offered $800. So to court it went, where it was found that the firm's policy was to serve coffee about 20 degrees hotter than most other places, sufficient to cause burns, which was apparently on the assumption that customers would get their coffee from a drive-through, then drive to work and drink it there, by which time the coffee would have cooled down to the right temperature. The prosecution also showed that in the decade up to the incident in 1992, McDonald's had received over 700 reports of burns and scalds from its coffee and settled claims totaling more than $500,000, which the company's representative said wasn't enough to cause a re-evaluation of their practices, adding that all hot food was a potential burn hazard and honestly they had more important things to worry about. None of that seemed to go down particularly well with the jury, which apparently came up with the figure of $2.8 million based on 2 days' coffee revenue for the Golden Arches. The Provisional IRA, the most active Republican paramilitary group during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, announced a ceasefire. A tentative peace process had been ongoing since the late 1980s, and in December 1993 British Prime Minister John Major and Irish Taoiseach Albert Reynolds had issued the Downing Street Declaration, which essentially said that the future of Northern Ireland would be decided by the people of Northern Ireland, that the British and Irish governments would honour whatever decision they collectively made, and that whatever else happened, the violence had to stop before anything more could be achieved. The Provisional IRA's ceasefire was partly in response to that, but more directly because their associated political party, Sinn Féin, wanted to be part of the discussions, and the declaration had made it very clear that that wasn't going to happen when bombings and shootings were still happening on a daily basis. And so across the channel to Belgium for race 11 of what was turning out to be a very contentious Formula One season, both on and off track. For the moment, most of the controversies involving Benetton and Schumacher were on hold, with Benetton and Schumacher due to appear at FIA tribunals in Paris on Tuesday. There were still headlines for the sweater merchants to make, though, as they announced a 3-year deal to use Renault engines, though Bernard Dudot at the press conference on a barge in the River Seine did clarify that they remained fully committed to Williams as well. So that was Benetton and Williams sorted for engines. Ferrari obviously made their own, so that left McLaren, where negotiations with Mercedes were still ongoing. The chairman of the Mercedes AG board was keen to add a top F1 team to their portfolio to go alongside Penske and the Works DTM team, but Edzard Reuter, head of Mercedes-Benz, was worried about the budget and was angling for McLaren and TAG to take the lead on engine development, which would mean tripling Woking's development budget, and left Ron wondering if maybe he should stick with Peugeot after all. To the rescue rode Jürgen Hubbert, head of production cars, who convinced Reuter that missing out on a deal with McLaren by being a cheapskate would be a big mistake, and dangled the prospect of tempting Michael Schumacher away from Benetton back home to Mercedes. So, although nothing was yet official, it was widely believed in the paddock that McLaren-Mercedes was as good as a done deal for 1995, and that Peter Sauber would be needing a new engine partner after just one official and one unofficial year. He might be looking for a new driver too, as the silly season for driver moves started. Heinz-Harald Frentzen had already been approached by Frank Williams in the aftermath of Senna's death, and he was still widely favoured to move to Didcot for 1995, though other rumours had him following Mercedes to Woking instead. Over at Jordan, Rubens Barrichello was likewise hot property, his manager Geraldo Rodriguez having apparently spoken to Benetton, Williams, Ferrari and McLaren, with the two Marlboro-sponsored teams apparently the favourites, though Eddie Jordan, keen to hang on to his young prodigy, put a $5 million price tag on him in the hopes of putting off the suitors. Looking forward 2 weeks after much hemming and hawing, the Italian Grand Prix would be going ahead, the influence within the GPDA of Messrs Berger, Lauda and Alesi enough to tip the balance of power, and the Scuderia Ferrari and Tifosi were delighted to hear it. The prospect of no Italian Grand Prix hardly bore thinking about. Here in Belgium, plans had been made to demolish one of the stands overlooking Eau Rouge and level a section of hill in order to provide a bigger runoff area. building a new stand further back, but that was clearly a big job, so for this year, and this year only, the famous sweeping corner of Eau Rouge, the most famous and challenging in the sport, had been replaced by an ugly first-gear chicane at the bottom of the hill, which would then reduce speeds on the climb out. Indeed, some of the F3000 cars over the weekend actually had difficulty getting up the hill at all. It was unpopular with just about everyone, but most agreed that it was better to suck it up for a year than lose the race. Additionally, with a narrow pit lane, the speed limit was reduced back down to 80 kph, enforced by radar speed traps, with the entrance now moved so that drivers would go straight on into the pits instead of taking the bus stop chicane. Another unhappy Belgian was Roland Brunscheider, the FIA's race director, safety delegate, starter and general all-round race weekend head man. While the word Silverstone hadn't officially been mentioned, veteran steward John Korsmit would now replace him until the end of the year as race director, and lawyer Roberto Causo's hitherto unofficial role as Max Mosley's representative at races was now made official. All that was left for Roland to do was turn on the lights at the start and wave the checkered flag at the end, a definite demotion. Several teams were coming under increased financial pressure too. Larousse had started the year looking reasonably secure, but all the amendments to the car needed by the safety regulations and the attempts to stop the engines overheating had eaten up most of the development budget, which meant they'd fallen behind, which meant they'd lost sponsors, and they'd been forced to let Olivier Beretta go. The team said he hadn't paid for his last 3 races and they couldn't let him have any more grace. Olivier said they'd asked him for the rest of the season's money up front, which he didn't have. Either way, he was out, replaced by team old boy Philippe Alliot, who was no longer needed at McLaren. Now Hakkinen was back. And if things were bad at Larousse, they were even worse at Lotus, where the promise of 1992 and 93 had turned to ash as the new 109 chassis had proved a spectacular failure, sponsors were again drifting away, and the team was in the red. Johnny Herbert's financing was secure enough, but Alessandro Zanardi's wasn't, and local driver Philippe Adams forked over £500,000 worth of Belgian francs for a 3-race deal, though Zanardi was at least given his home race in between. Philippe Adams, or Philippe Adam as it was pronounced, was born in Mouscron in 1969, the son of Bernard Adam, a former professional cyclist turned industrialist. Adam Sr. had taken an interest in motorsport, sponsoring Thierry's Tassin and Boutsen, and backing the career of his son Philippe as he moved into car racing in 1984. Things started slowly, placing 31st overall in the 1988 European Opel Lotus Championship, but a move to the UK saw him finish 6th in the following year's British F3 Championship with 2 second-place finishes, and ending the season ahead of the likes of Mickers, Hakkinen and Salo, Pauls, Warwick and Stewart, and Alain Menu. The Mickers dominated the following year, while he came 6th again with 2 runner-up spots. Feeling he wasn't progressing, he decided to try his luck in Japan for 1991, but could only manage 12th overall in F3 and a DNQ in his one entry in F3000. So back to Britain he came, joining Alan Docking Racing for 1992, and at the wheel of Aralt Mugen he took wins at Brands and Silverstone on his way to 2nd overall, albeit a rather distant runner-up to a dominant Gilda Ferran. British F2 beckoned, and despite falling out with his Madgwick International team partway through the season and switching to the rather less fancied Argo outfit, he ran Mieke van Hoel close for the title, eventually being awarded the laurels on appeal. For 1994, unable to find a berth in International F3000, he headed home and switched to Belgian Pro Car racing. He was due to race his Audi in a support race at the Belgian Grand Prix when word came out that Peter Collins needed cash and quickly. Taking out an insurance policy against his pro car result, rounding up a few local sponsors, and getting a top-up from Dad, he got together the necessary and snagged the drive. Given the limitations of the car, nobody was expecting too much, but he couldn't really do much worse, and at least he knew the track. There was one glimmer of hope for Lotus, though, a brand new Mugen V10 engine, actually entirely designed by Honda engineers but assembled at the Mugen plant to scotch any rumours of an official Honda return. It was 16 kilos lighter and on the bench delivered 780 horsepower, which meant it ought to be worth a good few seconds, and Johnny Herbert had tested it and praised its variable valve timing, which gave it more flexibility. The engine would be introduced in time for the Italian Grand Prix. There was also a slight moment of worry as some Belgian lawyers arrived at the garage on Friday, suspicious of the complicated financial arrangements around Adam's drive, but were apparently satisfied that it was all on the up and up. It was, as usual, a bumper crowd at Spa-Francorchamps. Not only is the race conveniently situated for French and German fans as well as the locals, but the race usually falls on the bank holiday weekend in the UK, meaning there's a strong British contingent. Plus, this year, the presence of Jos Verstappen and his podium place in Hungary meant the Dutch were out in force too. And all of them got very thoroughly wet on Friday, but with an even grimmer forecast for Saturday, everyone had to go out and give it a shot, though they all left it late in the hopes that things would dry out. With 10 minutes left of the session, Schumacher held provisional pole, but then the rain stopped. Taking a risk, Gary Anderson sent Rubens Barrichello out on slicks, with everyone else following suit. Schumacher had a brake balance problem and spun out on his fast lap, and to everyone's surprise, Barrichello zipped across the line to take the provisional pole in the dying seconds. Conditions on Saturday were even worse as the Belgian pro cars took to the track, and Philippe Adam blew everyone away, winning by a whopping 27 seconds, so at least he was good for his F1 money. When the F1 cars went out, though, it became obvious pretty quickly that the track wasn't going to be as quick as the previous day, and all anyone could usefully do was get a few laps of practice in. Except for Christian Fittipaldi, who'd blown an engine on Friday and hadn't set a representative time, and he became the only driver to improve on Saturday over Friday. Barrichello nervously watched the seconds tick down, but nobody went faster, and he and the Jordan team had their first pole position, with Schumacher alongside. Hill was third, and Irvine fourth to complete a spectacular qualifying performance for the Irish team, with Alesi and Verstappen on row 3, the French driver, livid after he'd been balked by Brundle, he thought deliberately, on his one slick-shod flying lap. Hakkinen and Coulthard lined up 7th and 8th, the Finn taking too long to get his settings right and the Scot missing the slicks window. Frentzen overcame nervous handling to place his Sauber 9th, alongside an excellent Martini in Minardi's 150th Grand Prix, while the Tyrrells had a pretty torrid time beset by traffic and spins. The Ligiers had both used up their 12 allotted laps before the track dried, as had Alliot, while Comas went off on his dry lap, so neither of the minor French teams had had a great weekend either. Herbert glumly pronounced himself happy just to have qualified, just ahead of David Brabham, who was improving all the time in the Simtech, while Gounod was still struggling with grip, or rather lack thereof, in his. Adam had a series of spins and shunts as he got to grips with the car and the conditions, but still managed to go quicker than the Pacifics to qualify safely for the race, albeit 12.7 seconds off pole. Bertrand Gachot had actually gone to bed on Friday in the race, but Fittipaldi put in a banzai lap to qualify 24th and bump him off again. Barrichello was the youngest pole sitter ever, beating the record set in 1981 by Andrea De Cesaris, now the second oldest driver on the grid, after Michele Alboreto, and the news set Brazil alight, instantly reviving interest in F1, while Rubinho himself tearfully recalled his mentor Ayrton Senna and his legendary wet weather prowess. It rained again overnight and the track was still wet during Sunday's warm-up, but by the time the cars went out onto the grid on race day, the sun was out, the track was dry and the forecast was clear. Nobody particularly expected Barrichello to be able to hold the lead, with Schumacher keen to get another 10 points on the board in case he was about to miss 2 races, and Hill just as keen to keep his title hopes alive with a win. Rubens led the pack away for the formation lap. The Jordans were planning for a one-stop strategy, with most of the rest going for 2 or 3. As they lined up afterwards, Philippe Adam, perhaps a little overwhelmed by the situation, lined up directly behind 25th place Gounod rather than his allotted grid slot alongside him, but it wasn't felt to be a problem as there was no one behind and he wasn't exactly gaining an advantage, so the green flag was waved. On went the green light and Barrichello got a fantastic start, jinking this way and that to block Schumacher's attempts to pass and holding the lead as they went through La Source, while Alesi got an absolute flyer and braked late to nick third, forcing Irvine out wide. Rubens led through Eau Rouge, while further back Herbert spun there and ended up last, but Schumacher got the toe-up camel and dived inside the Jordan into Les Combes to take the lead. As they came round to finish the lap, Alesi also got past into the bus stop, so as they finished lap 1, Schumacher led Alesi, Barrichello, Hill, Coulthard and Hakkinen in the points, with Verstappen, Irvine, Frentzen and Brundle making up the top 10. Schumacher immediately started pulling away, while at the back, Gounod spun at the Eau Rouge chicane right in front of the unfortunate Adam, who just had to stop and wait for him to get out of the way. As they began lap 3, one of Alesi's tyres lost pressure and threw the car completely off balance, so he was forced to park up, now with a new reason to be angry, at the old pits. But Barrichello wasn't promoted back to second because, thanks to his heavy fuel tanks, Hill and Coulthard had both got by at Les Combes, and Häkkinen then went through at the bus stop at the end of the lap, with Verstappen and Frentzen waiting their turn behind. Comas was the next casualty, an engine failure at La Source at the start of lap 4, but unseen by the cameras, Ukyo Katayama was going great guns, having made his way from 23rd up to 16th in 4 admittedly long laps. Schumacher was already 10 seconds ahead of Hill by now, while Barrichello was continuing to hold up Verstappen, and Frentzen, now joined by Berger, with Irvine and Brundle also heaving into view behind. Lotus's woes continued as a brake problem caused Herbert to go straight on at La Source, and he came into the pits to have his brake lines bled, losing 2 minutes stationary plus more time getting there. Meanwhile, a nice three-way scrap had developed between Verstappen, Frentzen and Berger, with the German taking 6th on lap 6 and setting about Barrichello, while the Dutch driver fell behind a charging Berger a lap or so later. The Sauber had a slight straight-line speed advantage over the Jordan, and every lap Frentzen got alongside going into Les Combes, only for Barrichello to tough it out and hold the place. As a quarter distance arrived, Fittipaldi was the first to stop for fuel, but if Frentzen was also on a 3-stopper we would never know, because on lap 11 the German braked way too late at Radial and spun while avoiding Barrichello. He did a 3-point turn, but it was too much for that ever-fragile transmission, and out he went. Häkkinen was the first of the major runners in for fuel next time around, rejoining between Verstappen and Blundell was also in, which gave Irvine a bit of a breather from having the Tyrrell filling his mirrors. Hill was in next time around, a decent 8.8 seconds, and as he was being serviced, Berger's engine went up in smoke as he entered the bus stop. He swerved back across the grass to take the pit entrance, and was nearly collected by Martin Brundle as he came in for his own stop. Next time around, Alios Larousse also ground to a halt at the bus stop, as Coulthard made his stop, getting back out ahead of Hill in 3rd place, and then it was Schumacher with a 23-second cushion. A quick stop got him back out on track just ahead of Gounod, who had to stamp on the brakes to avoid hitting him, and still in the lead, with Barrichello second, yet to make his stop and 12 seconds behind Schumacher. Not only had Coulthard got out ahead of Hill, but he quickly left his teammate behind somewhat and rapidly caught up to Barrichello, who was being held up by Adam and Gounod. The Belgian moved offline to let Barrichello through, and in the process hit some oil dropped by Berger's terminally sick engine at Pouhon, and went backwards into the gravel trap and out of the race. After a litany of spins in wet practice and qualifying, it seemed entirely in character, but on this occasion it seems he was just unfortunate. When the cameras found Barrichello again, he'd pulled back out a gap of about 3 seconds from Coulthard, who was in turn about the same amount ahead of Hill. The Jordan was light on fuel, of course, and Rubens came in on lap 19 for his only stop, a long 12 seconds, which put him back out between the McLarens as Gounod lost the back end at La Source and got moving again, while Schumacher made a rare goof of his own, getting a bit wide on the exit of Pouhon and gracefully pirouetting over the curb, winding up still facing the right way and getting moving again without missing a beat. Having caught out Adam and Schumacher, Pouhon claimed another victim on lap 20 as Barrichello went to lap Gounod, got on the dusty bit, or maybe some more of Berger's oil, had a bit of a tank slapper and went flying off, the gravel slowing him enough to gently bump the tyre barrier. Meanwhile, Schumacher was back on the pace, and Hill had caught Coulthard again, while Blundell was on Verstappen's tail and angling after 6th. Katayama having retired the previous lap with a dead Yamaha, meaning another good performance with no reward. Hill was close behind Coulthard now, but apparently unable to get close enough to have a go, and if the team were on the blower telling David to move over, he wasn't. Häkkinen came in for the second of what was looking like 3 stops, but his teammate was in trouble going out at Les Combes off camera as the Williamses lapped to Cesaris, Hill catching a big slide as he came through. The BBC spoke to Brundle later during the race, and he freely admitted he'd just made an error. Coulthard was by now catching Schumacher, and when the leader came in for his second stop on lap 29 with Hill following him in, the Scot went through into the lead for the first time in his career, but only for a lap until he came in himself and Schumacher retook the lead. A good stop put Coulthard back out just ahead of Hill again, and just 9.5 seconds behind Schumacher, and still catching with 14 laps to go. Verstappen came in and got out, still ahead of Blundell, who'd already been in, so the order was Schumacher, Coulthard, Hill, Häkkinen, Verstappen and Blundell in the top 6, with Irvine 10 seconds behind the Tyrrell, in 7th and the last unlapped driver. Panis came in from 8th, but stalled on the getaway and lost another 30 seconds getting going again, while David Brabham's Simtek shed its left rear wheel and he went backwards into the barriers at Les Fagnes. That left 15 still running, which became 14 when Fittipaldi's engine gave up the ghost. On lap 37 of the 44, Coulthard let Hill past, and the English driver disappeared very quickly into the distance. Was there something wrong with the Scots car? It seemed so, as the number 2 Williams came into the pits to have his rear wing checked, to DC's puzzlement as he hadn't detected anything wrong. Off he went again, now 4th, and just behind Häkkinen as they put another lap on Gunnar. As Hill charged in pursuit of Schumacher, 11 seconds up the road, Coulthard was keen to reclaim 3rd at least from Häkkinen, who was now looking like he wasn't going to make a 3rd stop after all. But with 5 laps to go, Coulthard's gearbox jammed in 4th, approaching Radion, and the Finn just disappeared off into the distance, while Coulthard was quickly reeled in and passed by Verstappen, followed by Blundell as they began lap 41. Unfortunately, Coulthard's gearbox woes meant that he couldn't brake in time for La Source, and he cannoned into the back of Blundell as he came past, sending him spinning. The marshals turned the Tyrrell round and he got moving again, having not even lost 6th place, as Eddie Irvine, who would have benefited, had just retired with a failed alternator. With just 3 laps to go now, Schumacher had sped up to match Hill lap for lap and seemed unassailable in the lead, and so it proved, as he won in Belgium for the 2nd time in his 4 visits, followed home by Hill, with Häkkinen taking another podium for McLaren Peugeot, followed by Verstappen, Coulthard and Blundell. So, even if he were, as expected, to miss the next 2 races, he would go into his 2-race ban with a commanding 36-point lead. Hill, Williams and Renault all expressed resignation that, they'd been beaten fair and square again, and that the championship would go to Schumacher and probably Benetton. But that evening, once the champagne had been sprayed and the motorhomes were being packed up, the stewards announced that Benetton number 5, Michael Schumacher, had been disqualified from the race. The wooden plank on the bottom of the car was showing 2.4mm of wear, which was well over the 1mm allowed by the FIA. An aggrieved team protested that he must have scraped it going over the curbs when he spun. Not so, said Charlie Whiting, who pointed to the fact that the marks on the wood ran front to back, so either the plank had been incorrectly installed in the first place, or the car had been running too low, the exact thing that the plank was supposed to prevent. Other cars were also showing similar wear patterns indicating they'd been over the curbs, but none was pronounced as Schumacher's. So, as usual, depending on your point of view, Benetton had again been caught cheating, or the FIA were once again desperately doing everything they could to artificially keep the title race open. In either case, it didn't look promising for Tuesday's tribunal in Paris. So, with Häkkinen bumped up to 2nd, Verstappen given his 2nd podium running, and Gianni Morbidelli rewarded for a solid, undramatic race with the last point, the arguments, recrimination and politics could resume in time for the visit to the home of arguments, recrimination and politics, aka Ferrari, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, in 2 weeks' time.